Sure, we're rolling with it. All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today on this beautiful Wednesday. We have the sun and the clouds out. Thank you, Earth, for this beautiful day. And for everyone joining tonight, my name is Ryann Louie. My pronouns are they and them. I'm the director of APIC Spokane. And I'm here to start us off with a little history about APIC Spokane, or APIC in general. In 1996, after the Welfare Reform Act took away access to resources and some civil liberties of citizens and immigrants, it really negatively impacted our communities of color, especially our immigrant communities, and that impacts a lot of Asian folks. Back then, we were categorized as Asian Pacific Islander. There's no rhyme or reason really to it. It just happened to be that we're from the same probably geographic region, and we got mixed in together with Pacific Islander folks. And today we're working on disaggregating Asian and Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, because we have vastly different ethnicities, cultures, experiences, and we see that a lot today through the COVID pandemic and how it has disproportionately impacted NHPI folks far worse than Asian and Asian American folks and any other communities that we have data on. So that is just one of the reasons why we're disaggregating, but also because our Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities have asked us for disaggregation. This is something that has been going on since the 90s, but it hasn't really picked up since recently. But back to what APIC started doing was legislative advocacy work and speaking with legislators on how policies can help provide more resources to our community members that were taken away. So kind of what we're possibly seeing now are the rights that we have of our community, especially for bodily autonomy, are being taken away, even though we've had it. And so we're going to have to fight for that again. But so APIC Spokane is one of 7 chapters throughout the state of Washington that has been working with the Asian community since the 90s. And so really since then, we've been pushing for police accountability, tenants' rights and fair housing, accessible housing, universal health care, environmental and social and racial justice. And we do that in solidarity with NHPI, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, LGBTQ plus communities, and people with disabilities, and other systemically oppressed community members. And really since COVID and the last administration, we've seen a massive increase in Asian hate and discrimination. And it's not the first time that it's happened. It's been happening for a long time, but it just really made Asian folks more of a target. And so APIC has been doing a few things in the ways to combat that. One is to help our community members, first of all, combat COVID and get them vaccinated and get them proper education and knowledge on COVID vaccinations and the safety of it, and access to the vaccine. And second is that we've been doing a lot of education about discrimination and mental health, and just trying to build community around the Asian populations here in Spokane, because we're only in Spokane about 2.5%, but that's still about 20,000 people. So we know that these numbers are lower than they actually are, because there's a lot of people that don't fill out the census, or they don't want to be seen or heard in the community. And there's other various reasons why. Language access is a huge barrier for our Asian populations. And so that's why APIC is working on translating a lot of our materials so that people can understand what is out there. A lot of people in our community just don't know what is available, and they don't know what they don't know. So we're trying to build that bridge to resources to help our community members. And so I'll pass it off to Pui-Yan today to talk about, it's one of our courses that we're hopefully going to branch out and start being able to share this with other organizations, institutions, just people that want to learn more about Asian Americans, and to really dismantle the model minority myth and just what media perceptions and just the dominant narrative and what they say about Asian people, because we're all unique, just like any one of you watching, any one of you here. We're all different people, and whatever we see on the news or in media is typically not representative of us. And so APIC is trying to create a home where people can be their authentic selves and to be in community with people that also share the same experiences. And so today, Pui-Yan will talk about the diversity and complexity of Asian American communities. And so Pui-Yan was our past co-chair of APIC for the last few years and has really just set us up for success and has helped to just continue educating and bringing community members to our organization. And so please put your hands together for Pui-Yan Lam.
I don't usually get such warm reception with my students. They don't clap when I walk into the podium, walk in front, behind the podium. So you're a great audience already. And so this meeting is very meaningful for me because I am a part of both SCAR and APIC. It's like two of my favorite groups coming together and do this together. And so I'm really excited about that. And I'm really grateful for all of you to be here physically with us, and also for people who are with us on Zoom or on Facebook, because I know this is a really nice afternoon. People want to be out, but you're here listening to me talking. So Ryan talked a little bit about kind of what APIC has been trying to do since the rise of anti-Asian, Asian American racism. And so immediately when we notice the rise of anti-Asian, Asian American racism, one of the first things that we did was bystander intervention training. But this is just kind of a reactive thing when we reacted when hate came in the surface. And we knew from history, and actually because I knew from history, this is something that we have seen time and time again in history. So I remember reading the news when the first case of COVID was reported in the United States and it was in the state of Washington. Immediately, my thought was worrying about exactly what had proven was going to happen with the rise of anti-Asian, Asian American racism. And so we thought as a next step is to, it is important for us to share with people within our community because oftentimes they don't know either, because our school system doesn't teach them about their own history, but also to the larger community. But also I understand that oftentimes people, when they think about learning history, they were thinking about learning about events, learning about what happened when, but it is also about giving us different lenses to look at what had happened. And so sometimes I realize the lens itself that we use, the recognition of what lenses people are using, are more important than remembering the facts in the history. And this is what I'm trying to accomplish. And so for people who know me, if I'm not thinking about something related to race or racism, I'm thinking about food. This slide was inspired by my mind wandering to think about dumplings. So how many dumplings do you need to eat in order to understand Asian American cultures? How many dumplings do you need to eat in order to understand Asian American cultures? So obviously this is a trick question, but I hope that you will think about it and wonder what this is all about. But I did have dumplings for lunch today, so I feel empowered by the dumplings I ate. So like I said, one of the things that we need to think about is what lens do we use when we look at the history of the United States? Because even if we're looking at the same set of dates and events, what happened, who, all this W, but you can still interpret history differently based on who you are and what role you play, or what role that are involved in the storytelling. And so one of the things that I like to help people or make people to think about is that what we think of as common sense is not necessarily what makes sense in the larger scheme of things. What common sense is oftentimes is the common sense of the ideology of those who are powerful. And I think the whole idea of common sense, even if we look at the history of the Supreme Courts with different ruling, and they are now under the spotlight also, but oftentimes what they rule would be, based on supposedly kind of the common sense, the common knowledge of the average American. But what the average American they had in mind is problematic oftentimes. And so that's why when I put together this presentation, I try to think of ways to help you question some of the common sense understanding of you might have been taught about Asian and Asian American history. So hopefully I can achieve that. And after the presentation, you can let me know if I succeed. I have succeeded in doing that. And this is a quote that I got from a historian who is also an ethnic studies scholar. And I think this quote that I took from him, it was exactly what he was trying to do for us to look at the history of Asian Americans from a different angle, and an angle that is oftentimes that got hidden and not necessarily an angle that people are even aware of. So I am just going to read it. And as I read it, I hope that everybody would think about what it means and what this historian is trying to convey. Asians, it must be remembered, did not come to America. Americans went to Asia. Asians, it must be remembered, did not come to take the wealth of America. Americans went to take the wealth of Asia. Asians, it must be remembered, did not come to conquer and colonize America. Americans went to conquer and colonize Asia. Asia not only provided markets for goods and outposts for military and naval bases, but also supplied pools of cheap labor for the development of America's plantation along its southern and western frontiers. And for those of you who are looking into books to learn more about Asian American history, I would highly recommend the works of Gary Okihiro. I think he not only does a very good job in his works to bring awareness about the history of Asian Americans, but also he challenges us to look at history from a different angle. So I feel that the way that I look at history also has been heavily influenced by him. So this is someone for you to check out. He published a lot, and not only on Asian American history, but history of people of color in general also. And one of the things that when I hear people say, kind of sometimes in casual conversation, that bothers me is kind of like how they look at the experiences of racism that Asian immigrants encounter. Because oftentimes the narratives, even narratives, stories told by Asian immigrants was, well, race didn't impact me very much until I came to the United States. Then I experienced racism as an immigrant. But to me, racism is something that is larger than the United States. Racism is based on a global hierarchy that has been developed over hundreds of years. So the racial hierarchy that we face is through the history of European and also US imperialism and colonization. And so if you are going to look at the history of Asia also, then you will see how Western imperialism and colonization have affected people in Asia. And so for most of us, I myself came from Hong Kong, which was a British colony, So before I came to the United States, I had already encountered racism and white supremacy through the British colonial system that I grew up with the education system that I grew up with. So I think this is the first kind of, I think, misperception or people somehow didn't think about when they look at the experiences of Asian immigrants. So this is a map that show you the influence of different European powers over in different parts of Asia. And you will see again how widespread it is. And so there are parts of Asia that were under French colonialism, and there were parts of Asia, of course, under the British influence with colonization from the British Empire, and other groups as well that is not represented in this map here with, for example, Dutch colonization, Dutch Portuguese colonization, and that has shaped how, you know, we as people from Asia think, also without recognizing the impact of European colonization and white supremacy that had been ingrained in our minds even after the Europeans left. Because it's not like they left, then we erase the memory, we erase the way that we think of the world. And so there could be internalized racism that we already brought with us because of that history before we set foot in the United States. So this is one thing I want you to keep in mind when you're trying to understand the experiences of Asian and Asian Americans here. And because of that history of European colonization, imperialism, including also US imperialism and colonization, then I would argue even before Asian immigrants set foot in the United States, our fates has already been linked to BIPOC people in the United States and elsewhere because of that. That, you know, even if we don't meet face to face, just because of the decision making of the European powers, what would be beneficial to them, it often a calculation of which groups we will go exploit because of what other group that we have encountered and we couldn't get what we needed. So that is always like, okay, you know, how we are going to deal with the Asian people there because of what we are dealing with people in Africa or Black people in the United States. And so we are all connected as a result of that long history that spans centuries. So I think this is another thing that people don't necessarily think about and being conscious about when they look at Asian American experiences and how Asian American experiences are interconnected here in the United States and globally with other BIPOC people. So first of all, I want to look at the origin of the term Asian Americans, because most people, especially immigrants, don't just land in the United States and automatically think I'm Asian Americans. Most people tend to identify with their ethnicity, so that is more immediate, or with their nationality prior to their migration to the United States. And so even though that before the term of Asian Americans were created, people of Asia or Asian in the United States have been lumped together. And there have been, you know, different terms that were used to describe them. For example, the term Orientals have been used. Now we would consider the term as offensive, but it was kind of the umbrella term that was imposed to us and not something that we choose as a people to identify with. So interestingly, the term Asian Americans had a very radical history. It was a term created as a result of the Third World Liberation Front strike. So it was a very multiracial efforts in the San Francisco Bay Area. It involves African-American college students. It involves Latinx college students, Native American college students, and Asian American students. At the time, one of the goals that they try to achieve is the teaching of our history at the university. So we want Asian American history to be taught. We want Black history to be taught. We want Native American history to be taught. We want Latinx history to be taught. And so it first started at San Francisco State and is spread to UC Berkeley. But with what was happening in the world at that time, it is not only solidarity among people of color in the United States, that it is also about solidarity with people in the third world, in the global South. And so again, it is about that global picture, global hierarchy that this movement is trying to bring to light. But it is also a movement within the many movements that were happening in the 60s. And so this is just one part that mostly had the college students involved. And the college students who were involved at that time, again, because of the exclusion laws we had in terms of immigration policy. So most of them were Asian American students. They were born in the United States because of the end of Asian immigration as a result of the exclusionary laws. They were mostly Japanese American, Chinese American, Filipino Americans, because they were the major groups who have come to the United States by that time. And they were the ones who came up with the name when they created the organization for themselves, the Asian American Political Alliance. And so this term has kind of a history of interracial solidarity. It has the history of solidarity with the third world. And it is a term motivated by the politics at the time. So it is a term that is political in nature. And so these are kind of all the ideals behind the term Asian Americans. So these are some of the pictures from the Third World strike at the time. And so I want to point out, this is in Chinese, but this banner there, it says police brutality. So, so this is one of the things that was on the mind of those who were protesting and advocating for the teaching of ethnic studies and in general, racial justice for all of our people. So this is another picture from the different student groups that were involved, with members of different student groups that were involved at the time. And this is different artifacts from the Third World Strike that is now on display at UC Berkeley. Again, one of the major sites of the Third World Liberation Front strike. So besides the Third World Strike, there is kind of the larger social movements that were going on at the time. And so one of the things that also people might not recognize in the history of this period, that Asian Americans also were involved in the broader civil rights movement. And they were also inspired by the different movements that were going on with the Black Power movements. And so Asian Americans started to think about, their identity, pride in their identity, and also forming their movements. It's also, they are also learning from the American Indian movement, the anti-war movement, because it also, with the Vietnam War going, also it raises a lot of the questions for Asian Americans in terms of their identity, their solidarity, how race was part of what was happening in Vietnam. And so again, that's kind of one connection why they think that this has to be more than Asian Americans in the United States, but also they had to look at what was happening in Asia at the time. And so, besides racial inequity, economic inequity in the United States, but that they realized they have to look at US imperialism as well. And so they call for the self-determination of Asian Americans and also self-determination of people of Asia, again, with their history of European colonization or US colonization. And again, this movement was built with mostly people who were American-born, US-born at the time because of the prior exclusionary immigration laws. But interestingly, with the civil rights movements, then we had immigration reform in the 60s, then all of a sudden the demographics of Asian America changed because some of the discriminatory quota, discriminatory measures get lifted, then allow for more people from Asia to move to the United States. So by the time that they built this identity, created this term, then all of a sudden, a lot more immigrants were coming from Asia with more ethnicity and more diversity. So it's kind of like, okay, then now what does the term Asian Americans mean? And one thing about terminology is, regardless of its roots, even though it had this very radical roots, it is political, but then it would be kind of adopted by the government and other institutions. And then it became just a bureaucratic term. And so US Census and other places, government agencies adopted the term. And then, as Ryan mentioned earlier, then kind of like they were figuring, oh, there were other groups of people that kind of doesn't have a big umbrella term that they belong to. We would just lump them together, with Pacific Islander. But that is very different because originally this is a term that Asian Americans created to identify themselves because they didn't like the identities, the labels that have been imposed of them. And that's why it is important for us as Asian Americans to honor what our Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander siblings are asking of us now, that they don't want to be lumped together with us. They don't want us to use the term API or AANHPI anymore because, for us too, it would be counter to the spirit of how we call this term in the very, very beginning. It is about self-determination. It is about the ability to define ourselves. So I just wanted to explain a little bit too in this context what Ryan had talked about in the introduction. And another thing that it bugs me a lot because it is something that's not only non-Asians think of when they think of Asian American. I sometimes hear from young Asian Americans that, oh, well, our people are quiet, our people, don't fight. Well, maybe it's because of our culture. Maybe, I don't know, maybe because my parents or grandparents are immigrants. And so we just kind of work hard and try to, get settled in the United States. But this is not true. This is far from the truth. And so especially for me, I am an immigrant. I came from Hong Kong. And so if you have followed the news about Hong Kong in the last few years, we are not people who sit quietly. We are not people who could be shut up, silenced easily. So for me, it's like, where did these people get this idea from? So if we look at the history of Asia, with all these very large scale rebellions or social movements that had taken place, it really is all over Asia. So it is not like, well, maybe this one Asian culture is an exception. No, all across Asia, we have different kinds of rebellions. We have anti-colonial movements all across Asia. People are more aware of the independence movement in India, but if we look at Vietnamese history, they also try to fight for the independence from the French, and the Filipinos also they fight against Spanish colonization, and then they had to fight against the Americans because as soon as they gained the independence from Spain, then the U.S. moved in and take over, and then they fought for many years too against U.S. colonialism. And we can look at, the student movements in Japan back in the 60s, and South Korea and Taiwan. People there fought for many decades for their for democracy. even though there were really heavy-handed suppression from the governments, right now it's kind of deja vu with what's going on in the Philippines. They fought also very hard in the anti-Marcos movements back in there. And so we have many examples, even in recent times, how different people in Asia have fought for their rights. In Taiwan, Thailand, Myanmar, Sri Lanka going on right now. Again, also with what's happening with Philippines. So it is hard to, for us to say that with all these examples from history, all these examples from recent times, that we somehow are people who are just quiet and docile and do not fight back. So I hope if there is anything that you remember from this, it would be, no, Asian and Asian Americans always have the ability to fight against oppression, even in the worst situation. Yeah, and we just don't, we don't get intimidated. I'm just, in my mind, I'm thinking of people, like from my home city, people who just don't want to shut up no matter what. And so to look at it broadly, because oftentimes cultures were used as a reason why all Asians don't fight back, why, and first, it is wrong. But, be aware of any other kind of simplistic cultural explanations about how Asian and Asian Americans are supposed to behave, even when it sounds positive, with all these ideas about, these good values that Asian people have because of their cultures, because oftentimes there are reasons for those cultural explanations, even if they're positive. And Ryan also talked about the modal minority myth. I don't know if you are familiar with the modal minority myth, that it became popular, I think, back in the 80s, but I think the roots of it was a little bit earlier than that. It was the idea that, Asian Americans have been so successful, we do well in school, and we, go to college, we work hard, and, even though we are supposedly a minority, we are able to succeed regardless of, barriers, regardless of the discrimination that we face. But the model minority myth is not necessarily something that is new. We actually look at history, there are always kind of two narratives coexist at the same time. That if you look at the very beginning of Chinese migration, when white people in power wanted to justify why they should bring Chinese into the United States, for different reasons. First, it was trade, and then later it would be labor. Then at that time, they would have like glowing comments about how good these people are, and therefore we should bring them in for whatever self-interest that white people in power want to achieve at the time. But then what we have learned from history, it only takes like the flip of a switch. Then we went from the good, docile, obedient, hardworking people to evil people who are scheming something big, to overturn whatever is good about the United States. So that shows to us that these are tools, these are kind of manipulation of those in power use for their interest and not for our sake, even if they have positive things to say about us. So I'm just kind of like, when I was preparing the switch, I have kind of this going on in my head, like kind of my visual image of how the modal minority myth and then yellow peril, they coexist, and then they just flip back and forth and back and forth. And we see that with the pandemic too. Like, in one stroke, they were talking about, the good Asian American, but when the pandemic hits, and all of a sudden they flip the switch, and then we are the yellow peril again. And recently it's also like, oh, with China, all these, spies and all these things, that they recycle those those rhetoric from way back then over again. But again, this is not new. From the very beginning of Asian American history, they keep flipping these two switches: yellow peril, model minority, yellow peril, model minority. So just kind of some of the rhetoric that they would use under model minority. Again, it goes way back, even with the beginning of Asian migration, because they have to justify why, we should bring in the Asian immigrants. And then they flip to how we are being disobedient, how we are the opium smokers, we are the criminals, we are the sexual predators. It is interesting, is there's always that gender dimension to it too. And then we are morally corrupt, and our success, then it turned into, when they flip that narrative, then it turned to, look, these are greedy people. That's why they're so successful, because they want to rip off from Americans. Of course, that means white Americans. And so if, people say, okay, maybe the cultural explanations are not the explanations, maybe it is something else that Asian, or especially Asian immigrants, don't fight. Maybe it is because of language barriers. Maybe it is because of educational barriers. But, what if we look at the history again, we don't wait until the second generation, the American-born generation, Asian immigrants had joined the fight for rights immediately after they landed. Again, it is maybe for some immigrants, it is because they have more education. But for others, even if they did not have a whole lot of education, it didn't stop them from fighting back. So I don't know how many of you have heard of these, the strike of Chinese railroad workers. I hope people know about the Chinese railroad workers. Sometimes I ask my students, they don't know, which makes me wonder what happens in the education system. So, so the Chinese workers, because again, with the justification of the white capitalists, they were, they had this continental railroad they had to build, but they could not use white workers. They tried with the Irish workers, but with the, geography, they realized that they would have to look for an alternative source of labor. So again, white labor is what they prefer. They hire a lot of Irish, but that is not enough, because before the railroad, it is hard for the white European immigrants to go to the west side of the United States. So they realized that it was cheaper for them to bring the Chinese in to build the railroad. And so again, then they are, at first with all these positive attributes that tie to the Chinese, but then the Chinese rail worker, they realized even though they made up of the majority of workers at the time in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, they were paid less, they were treated harshly, and even when they were paid less, also that the railroad company charged them for meals and all these other expenses. And so they didn't think that it was right. And so they went on a strike. So think about that. These are not highly educated people. I don't think a lot of them were fluent in English. And think about the construction of railroad. They were in unfriendly terrain, but that didn't stop them from going on strike. And so interestingly, again, to see how interrelated our fate is. So at first, the Chinese workers were preferred because, for the white Californians, they didn't want Black workers either. But now that the Chinese were on strike, then, then they were trying to figure, is it okay? Maybe we can bring some Black workers to end the strike, to be the strike breaker. So again, all these are interconnected. Our fates, how we are connected in the calculation of the interests of white people with power and wealth. It started from kind of way back then. But they realized, because all these Chinese rail workers are stranded, kind of in High Sierra, all they needed to do was to stop the supply of food. So they staffed the Chinese railroad worker to force them to go back to work. So that was unfortunately the end of that strike, that they were not successful. But again, we fought back. Regardless of, that we were new to the United States, we had language barriers, or we were not the most educated. So I don't think, language barrier is an explanation or the reason that has stopped us from fighting as Asian immigrants, Asian Americans. So, think about that. Don't just readily accept those easy explanations that seem to be common sense. No, this commonsensical explanation or way of looking at Asian American is far from the truth. And the other places where Asian immigrants had fought for better treatment is in farm work. That Asians immigrants were brought after the construction of railroad to work in the farms in the West Coast in California. And so they were, at that time, the majority of farm workers. And then they started to bring in Mexican farm owners had started to bring in Mexican farm workers also. So again, the same calculation of economic interest brought Asian and Mexicans together, and oftentimes worked side by side. Oftentimes we were pit against each other. Asians being, Mexican was used to pit against Asian, or Asian were used to pit against the Mexicans. But there were different kind of moments of solidarity as well. So one of these significant interracial movements was the Osner-Sugar Beets workers' strike of 1903. So this is from way back then. This is the first, one of the first multiracial unions that was formed in U.S. labor history. And so the Mexican workers and the Japanese workers, they didn't speak, each other's language. They don't necessarily speak a lot of English. So I was reading that they oftentimes, in order for them to band together and form the unions, they had to work through interpreters. But that, again, language barrier didn't stop them from working together. And so it started with 500 Japanese farm laborers and 200 Mexican laborers. They formed the Japanese Mexican Labor Association, and quickly they grew their membership to 1,200, and they kept growing, I think, soon after. And so they went on strike. So one of the reasons why that caused the strike was that they changed the subcontracting system that had led to lower wages than before, and also there were fees associated with the subcontracting. So they were trying to fight against that, and they were having some success. And after they gained some success from their strikes, they wanted to seek official recognition from the American Federation of Labor, so that they could be officially, their union kept being officially recognized by them. But this is their decision. So the American Federation of Labor decided that, because at that time, a lot of the white workers, and the unions, they were part of the anti-Asian movements, anti-Asian immigration. And so at the time they said, okay, we will accept you as a chapter if you are going to have only Mexicans in your union. We don't want any Japanese or any Chinese, but even though there were not many Chinese, because they got pushed off, discriminated against, but it doesn't matter. We are all the same. And so they would not accept the union if they had Chinese or Japanese membership. And so how do you think the Mexican union members respond when they heard this is what the American Federation of Labor wants? So this is moments of solidarity. So your letter in which you say the admission with us of the Japanese sugar beets and farm laborers into American Federation of Labor cannot be considered is received. We beg to say in reply that our Japanese brothers here were the first to recognize the importance of cooperating and uniting in demanding a fair wage scale. They were not just with us, but they were generous when one of our men was murdered by hired assassins of the oppressor of labor. They gave expression to the sympathy in a very substantial form. In the past, we have consulted, fought, and lived on very short rations with our Japanese brothers and toiled with them in the fields, and they have been uniformly kind and considerate. We would be forced to them and to ourselves and to the cause of unionism if we now accepted privileges for ourselves which are not accorded to them. We are going to stand by men who stood by us in the long, hard fight, which ended in a victory over the enemy. So the Mexican farm laborers stood by their Japanese brothers and not accepted the AFL's offer. So we therefore respectfully petition the AFL to grant us a charter under which we can unite all the sugar beet field laborers of Osner without regard to their color or race. We will refuse any kind of charter except one will wipe up race prejudices and recognize our fellow workers as being as good as ourselves. That is a very, very powerful letter. And then the other, oh, sorry, I forgot about that.
Just a quick tech break. Should be just 30 seconds. We just connect to the speaker so you'll be able to hear the next upcoming video if you're on Facebook or Zoom.
I'm so sorry about that. I got excited about like talking about this and completely forgot when I stepped up to the podium here. So this is another interracial example of interracial solidarity that is unfortunately forgotten because when people think of the United Farm Workers, they think of Chicanos workers, when actually the Filipinos played a very important part of that. So I'm going to show this short video.
It's a part of American history that was almost forgotten. When farm labor leaders went on strike in California in the 1960s, against the backdrop of the civil rights movement, one group played a pivotal role in the worker and immigrant rights.
I never knew this history growing up. I don't think anyone from my community knew about it.
Marissa Arroy is talking about the Filipino community, who make up the third largest Asian population in the US. As a filmmaker, she is keeping this story alive.
In the 20s and 30s, over 100,000 Filipino men flocked to America seeking new opportunities. They became migrant workers and followed the crop cycles all over the West Coast.
Larry Itliong and the Filipino Manongs, which means elder, began the Delano grape strike to protest the unjust wages and poor working conditions of farmers.
I'm going to be very frank with you. I have all kinds of guts, you know. I'm not scared of nobody. And I'm a son of a bitch in terms of fighting for the rights of Filipinos in this country.
Farm owners often pitted Filipino workers against Mexican workers in an attempt to sabotage the protests. Despite those attempts, the biggest protest, the Delano grape strike, was built on the partnership between the two groups. On September 8, 1965, Filipino farmers led by Larry Itliong protested unfair wages and working conditions. Cesar Chavez, who led the Mexican farmers, wanted to wait 2 or 3 years before they protested. But Itliong told Chavez they couldn't wait. The Manongs were getting old.
Where are your brothers and sisters over here? Come on! Come on now!
Itliong asked him to join forces, and together they founded United Farm Workers, or UFW.
The work he did was significant enough to get us a union. at a time when I think for the most part, Filipinos didn't really speak up.
The strike lasted 5 years and gained national and international support. The successful protests resulted in a contract granting farmers fair wages, benefits, and protections.
So important to humanize and let communities know and let kids of color and their families know that we are part of American history.
Gail Romasanta co-wrote a children's book about Larry Itliong that was published this year.
Filipino Americans, now that we've been here for a few generations now, you can ask to be at the seat at the table and you can demand why your story isn't out there.
It's a story still relevant today about the rich and the poor, unions, immigrant backlash, the food we eat, and the workers who get the food to our tables. Romasanta says it's a story about dignity.
And when you start looking at support systems for our communities, and for our marginalized communities, for those who don't necessarily speak out or ask for a seat at the table, this story is for you because it asks you to do more. You can do more.
Itliong and the Manongs are remembered beyond Filipino American History Month. In 2013, California rewrote their history textbooks to include Filipino Americans in the farm worker movement. There is a school named after Itliong and another Manong, Filipino labor leader Philip Veracruz. And the Golden State now recognizes October 25th as Larry Itliong Day.
Got my music accidentally played in the background. So yeah, so you're just listening to a song in Cantonese. Okay. And so these are some examples of how Asian immigrants have fought for their labor rights. But this is not just back in history. So we have more recent examples of how immigrants, and in this case, immigrants, women specifically, that they had fought really hard for labor rights. So this is back in 1982 with 15,000 Chinese government workers strike. And so you can see in the picture, this short video here is in Cantonese, but I want to show this. It has the English subtitle. I hope you can see that, but even if you cannot see that, I just want you to watch this old woman get a sense of probably how she was like back then. So this is years later that she was interviewed on the about the 1982 government workers' strike that she was a part of.
哥倫布拍，佢哋寫呢一沓嘢咁高，要我出去講，我話嘥氣，我講咩啊？我好簡單講聽佢，我哋工人應該要團結，一朵鮮花不是春，萬紫千紅才是春。一朵花唔係叫做春天。 係全部嘅花開晒啦，就叫做春天，即係代表我哋啲工人係靠一個人嘅力量唔得，我哋要全體工人，要45000幾個工人出來，才係叫做春天，即係要力量。
I just wanted to show this clip because of her vibe. That's just, I can imagine, I try to imagine what she was like when she was younger and in that 1982 strike. I like that. It's like, I don't need all these notes. I can just go up and speak. So language is not a barrier. And other things that we have fought for, also that involves Asian immigrants. And I think this is something that people, again, not necessarily would think about, is that Asian immigrants were part of the fight against environmental racism, Asian immigrants and Asian Americans. This is I think this is environmental racism in more like, I think, through occupational exposure, I would still count it as an environmental racism because it is about exposure to chemicals. I don't know how many people would think about the exposure of toxic chemicals through the nail salon industry. And so this is something that has more studies that look at the impact. And so this is a documentary. I think it is available from Canopy, which I think it means that you can get it from the Spokane Public Libraries. And so it talked about an owner of a nail salon who's a Vietnamese immigrant and had, kind of joined the work to advocates for laws to require safer materials to be used in the nail salon industry with the products that they have to use. So I thought that was really inspiring. I really like this documentary. And then the other very, very powerful story, and this has a long-lasting legacy, that it was the post-Katrina activism in New Orleans Vietnamese community. So way back then, there was a lot of attention on how African Americans were mistreated in the post-Katrina rescue efforts, but also rebuilding efforts. And so the Vietnamese community was completely overlooked. They were there also, and their community was very hard hit by that. And so there is a very good documentary also. I think this is also available from Canopy that documented the fight. First is how to rebuild the community. Also when they were not getting helped because they were completely overlooked, and how they had to help each other within the community and rebuild the community. And then later find out that the city was trying to build a landfill very close to their community for all these trash and toxic materials that were left over as a result of the hurricane. And it was a very moving documentary because it is a very intergenerational movement. You see the American-born kids working alongside with their grandparents. You will see other feisty old immigrants in that documentary demanding the government to do what is right. And the legacy that they left behind, also they worked closely together with the Black community. So they built interracial coalition through this that also lasted beyond what they had to fight after Katrina. And also it made a generation to be aware of the importance of participating in the political process. And so a year later, New Orleans elected, I think, their first Asian American city council member. And the organization that was formed as a result, it has become a very, very powerful organization that builds on the legacy of the fight of the activism in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. So I would highly encourage you to check out the documentary, but also check out the organization and look at the fantastic things that they have done. And so this is a story about that, the legacy of that. Unfortunately, they had to fight again. The community had to fight again. At first, they fought against the location of the landfills after Katrina, but more recently, they have to fight against having gas power plants built also close to their community. So unfortunately, the fight against environmental racism continued. But still, you see all these older folks. So this is not just for the younger people to participate in activism. And so this is just another picture of that shows also kind of, this is a multiracial coalition who are who's fighting together. So this is more recent. And now I'm going to talk about other examples of how Asian Americans, Asian immigrants have fought for their rights, but I just put it also, this is something close to home. And so this is about the Anti-Chinese League of Spokane back in 1892. So I'm not going like linear here with my presentation. And many anti-Chinese league, many anti-Asian leagues were created all across the West. But we have one here in Spokane as well. And we have an ordinance that again was very typical of the time way back then when the Chinese were pushed to the laundry business because white workers, white businesses didn't want the competition from them. But even when there was a niche that they were pushed into, there were attempts to make their life difficult, to make it difficult for them to do businesses. So different places, they have put in ordinances like the ones that the city council passed way back then to charge $200 a year for license fees, targeting Chinese laundries as well. And the reason why I wanted to talk about that is because, again, this is another example of how Asian immigrants fight back, Asian Americans fight back. And oftentimes we use the legal system and use the courts to fight for our rights. And also because of that, then oftentimes what we fought for Asians then had an implication or legacy for other groups as well because of setting the legal precedents on different issues. So this is a very short version about the Yik-Woo versus Hopkins case about the racially discriminatory ordinances targeting laundry businesses.
Countless statutes governing our daily lives, by their terms, don't discriminate against people based on their race or other factors prohibited by the Constitution. Yet government officials who enforce such laws may apply them differently to different people based on such characteristics. Does the Constitution prohibit such unequal application of laws that on their face don't discriminate? The United States Supreme Court first addressed this issue, along with the threshold question of whether the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause prohibits discrimination based on alienage or nationality in Yik-Woo versus Hopkins. Yik-Woo and Wo Li were Chinese citizens who resided in San Francisco in the 1800s. They were among over 200 Chinese nationals living in San Francisco who ran commercial laundries. In 1880, San Francisco enacted an ordinance that required laundry operators whose businesses were in wooden buildings to obtain permits from the fire warden. Virtually all laundries in the city operated in wooden buildings. Initially, Yik-Woo and Wo Li were granted permits after their laundries were deemed safe by the fire warden. They maintained their laundries in the same safe conditions thereafter. However, by 1885, when they applied for permit renewals, the fire warden denied them permits, while also denying permits to all but one of the other 238 Chinese laundry operators. At the same time, the fire warden granted permits to 80 of the 81 non-Chinese laundry operators in the city. Yik-Woo and Wo Li continued to operate their laundries after being denied permits. They were convicted of violating the ordinance requiring a permit and were fined. After both refused to pay the fines, a municipal court judge ordered them to be incarcerated in lieu of paying the fines. Yik-Woo appealed to the California Supreme Court, which affirmed his conviction. Wo Li filed a petition for writ of habeas corpus in federal circuit court, which denied him relief. Both men then appealed to the United States Supreme Court.
So that was a very important court case. So people in law school would study this again because of that. That has wide implication of how our legal system look at discrimination. It doesn't have to be explicit in the language of the law, but we can make a case if it is in the impact of what the law creates and which groups are disproportionately affected by that. And Asian immigrants, the other thing that they had to fight is to fight against school segregation. Again, this is not something that is not necessarily known. In this case, it was by a very interesting couple. They have very interesting stories, especially the mother, Mary Tabe. So this is a woman that I would encourage you to look her up and study her interesting life. And so they were, Mary and Joseph Tabe, they came to the United States when they were very, very young. And for Mary Tape, she came as an orphan. And so, so she was not brought up by the Chinese family or community. And so because of that, she was very well assimilated because she was raised by white people. And Joseph Tape also was very assimilated compared to most immigrants at the time. And he actually worked for Leland Stanford as an interpreter and for other businesses also. And they also, in their social circles, in their life, they mainly interacted with white people. And when they were trying to send their daughter to an all-white school, her daughter was rejected. And so then the family fought to say that, well, all children have the right to education. So you have to take my girl. I will have to, fight you in courts. And so they actually won in courts. So the court agreed that your daughter had a right to public education. So she should get admitted to a school. But the schools, by what they decided to do is, to the extent, this is the extent that they didn't want a Chinese student in the school. So instead of just letting her admitted to the all-white school that she was trying to get in, they created a school just for the Asian children, so that they can still basically achieve their goal, because ultimately what they just didn't want was having Asian children to be educated along with white children. So they would rather go through the length of creating a different school so that schools won't have to be integrated. And so after she found out, Mary Tape wrote to the Board of Education. So this is something that I want to show because it shows kind of a little bit of how she was as a person, and her fighting spirit, that I think is important to recognize, and we can see it through the letter she wrote. I see that you're going to make all sorts of excuses to keep my child out of public schools. Dear sirs, will you please tell me, is it a disgrace to be born Chinese? Didn't God make us all? What right have you to bar my children out of the school because she is a Chinese descent? There is no other worldly reason that you could keep her out, except that. I suppose you all go to churches on Sundays. Do you call it a Christian act to compel my little children to go so far as to a school that is made in purpose just for them? My children don't dress like the other Chinese. They look just like as funny amongst them, Chinese origin students, as the Chinese in Chinese dress look amongst you Caucasian. Besides, if I had any wish to send them to a Chinese school, I could have sent them 2 years ago without going to all this trouble. You have expended a lot of the public money foolishly, all because of one poor little child. Her playmates are all Caucasians ever seen since she could toddle around. If she is good enough to play with them, then is she not good enough to be in the same room and study with them? You had better come and see for yourselves. See, the Tape are not the same as other Caucasians except in features. It seems no matter how a Chinese may live and dress, as long as you know they are Chinese, then they are hated as one. There is not any right or justice for them. You have seen my husband and child. You told him it was not Mamie Tape you object to. If it were not Mamie Tape you object to, then why didn't you let her attend the school nearest her home, instead of first making one pretense, then another pretense of some kind to keep her out? It seems to me Mr. Mulder has a grudge against this 8-year-old Mamie Tape. I know they are not no other child, Chinese child, that cares to go to your public Chinese school. May you, Mr. Mulder, never be persecuted like the way you have persecuted little Mamie Tape. Mamie Tape will never attend any of the Chinese schools of your making, never. I will let the world see, sir, what justice there is when it is governed by the race prejudice of men. Just because she is of Chinese descent, not because she doesn't dress like you, because she does, just because she is descendant of Chinese parent, I guess she is more of an American than a good many of you that is going to prevent her being educated. I think it is a very powerful letter. And I think for me personally, the fact that it is not a letter necessarily written in perfect English grammar makes it more powerful, that we can fight with language barrier. We can fight with, the way that however we speak English or however we write English, it is the same, that we have our voice no matter. So I think that has an extra layer of meaning to me personally. But there are layers that we can kind of dissect from the letter too. Kind of the idea that in order to be accepted, in order to be assimilated into the American society, you almost have to abandon your people, because she repeatedly talking about how they intentionally make the children only associated with Caucasian children. They were taken outside of the community. They thought by doing that, they would have earned kind of their rights, but then they find out this is not the case. So that is kind of set too with what she stressed in the letter about, how assimilated they are, but still the outcome is the same. And this is not just Chinese Americans, children face segregation, but that was extended to other Asian children too, that they had to fight against school segregation. And also our criminal justice system also doesn't protect, our criminal legal system doesn't protect Asian immigrants and Asian Americans. In fact, our criminal legal system worked against Asian immigrants from the very, very beginning. So this is another important court ruling. Again, this is also another example of how interconnected our fate is as people of color. And I think I might have a typo there. So they are Chinese minor. And so in this case, that was a Chinese minor that was murdered by a white man with the testimonies of one white witnesses and 3 Chinese witnesses. He was found, George Ho was found guilty at the very beginning. And so at the time, California laws stated that no Black or mulatto person or Indian shall be allowed to give evidence in favor of or against a white man. So the racist law was already in existence at the time, but then in the language, they didn't specifically say Chinese. And therefore, that they were able to, the 3 Chinese witnesses were able to testify. But then when the case went to California Supreme Court, they overturned the ruling on the ground that even though the law didn't say Chinese specifically, but we know with the intention of the law that basically it applies to them as well. So again, we see the interconnectedness of the fates of people of color. What had happened, if a law was created with the intention targeting other people of color, it doesn't mean that, if Asian Americans were not in the radar at that time, we would not be affected by the racist law, because ultimately it is white people against people of color who were, seen as all the same, even though sometimes they try to play divide and conquer. So we had, because of that kind of the lack of protection from our criminal legal system, so it was pretty much a fair game for white people to assault, to attack people of Asian descent. And so I just want to bring it closer to home, that at one point, anti-Asian sentiment was so strong that actually the KKK thought that the state of Washington would be a good kind of place for them to go expand and recruit members. So especially in Yakima, there were strong anti-Japanese, anti-Filipino prejudice. And so the KKK went all the way over there to recruit. Again, we experienced violence. This is an example from Yakima also with the violence against Filipino to drive them out of town. So basically, that was the intention, to get them scared. And here, another example from the state of Washington is this time the target was South Asian immigrants. So the same thing that they're trying to use, white men try to use violence to push these South Asians out of Bellingham. Again, all this happened because the criminal legal systems don't protect Asian American. But it didn't happen. It didn't just happen way back then. Even in the 80s, we see something similar with the murder of Vincent Chin, a Chinese American who was mistaken for being Japanese at the time in Detroit. Especially, there were a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment because supposedly they were the ones causing all the economic problem, causing the economic recession. And so Vincent Chin, even though he was not Japanese, he was Chinese American, he was beaten to death on the night of his bachelor's party. And because they got mad at him for them losing their jobs. And so, a long story short, that even with the community trying to protest, advocates on behalf of Vincent Chin's family, in the end, these two people who killed Vincent Chin, they only had to pay a little bit of money, and that was it. And so with the outrage, so even though it was something that happened in Detroit, it became a national movement across Asian American communities in the United States to call for justice. And so this was considered as another important moment in Asian American history with the nationwide activism that's going on. Okay. So sorry about that. But I think this is something that we need to think about. For example, with the Atlanta shooting. Oh, I think I think I might have to get in the year wrong. There are. I'm trying to think. Okay. So with the shooting, there were a lot of talks about. So it is 2021. I was thinking for some reason I have my mind, this is 2023. So, so this is why I'm not a historian, even though sometimes I have to talk about history. I cannot get my years straight. So 2021. And so there were a lot of talks on what should the Asian American communities do about the shooting, about the anti-Asian hates. And so some will wonder if they should go to law enforcement and ask for protection. But there are groups who are trying to point out that actually law enforcement had not been a protector of our communities, especially for the people who were targeted in the Atlanta shooting. Oftentimes, it was the police that had threatened the safety. They were the ones who our community were fearful of. And so actually in some places, there were movements to decriminalize unlicensed massage places so that they don't have to be subject to police raids or other police harassment. So basically what I wanted to point out also is how we have to take into consideration as Asian Americans, how our criminal legal system has treated us and what we would want as solution for the problems that we face in our community. So also there were police shootings of Asian Americans in the state of Washington with the case of Tommy Lee, a teenager that was killed by the police. Other places with also cases of police shooting. So my question that I asked, how many dumplings do we need in order to understand Asian cultures? This is one last tidbit from the history I want to show. So why do the United States has so many Chinese restaurants? There were statistics about how there were more Chinese restaurants than all these fast food chains kind of together. Actually, the proliferation of Chinese restaurants in the United States was the reaction to the discrimination we face as Chinese immigrants. So you might know about the Chinese Exclusion Act that bar almost all Chinese from coming to the United States, but there was a tiny little loophole that was meant basically for the wealthier Chinese, because there is also a class dimension to it. Either you're wealthy, you're merchants, maybe we don't mind you as much, because mostly it was about the fear of competition from Chinese labor. And that loophole that allowed Chinese people to come to the United States for the purposes of creating businesses allow for what is called the Laumin loophole. So Chinese were able to use the excuse of running a restaurant to still come to the United States, and that caused the beginning of the proliferation of Chinese restaurants. And so what I'm trying to say with this is, sometimes people use, oh, we have all these restaurants, different ethnic restaurants in our community. It shows that we are very accepting. No, even in the height of anti-Chinese movement, white people had no problem eating our food. They had no problem, having us cook for them. In fact, it is oftentimes what BIPOC people were forced to do because of discrimination, to cook or to clean for white people. So, when we think about food, when we think about what it means, it is not necessarily a good indicator of how accepting and equal our society is. So no amount of dumping eatings will help us to get to that critical consciousness. So we can cook or eat away systematic racism. So we need to act organized. We need to remember the radical origin of the term Asian Americans and join efforts of APIC and SCAR in fighting against racial injustices. Sorry, I go way too long, but because I just love talking about this stuff because it is important.
Thank you so much, Pui-Yan, for that amazing presentation. Just a really quick shout out to our next meeting that's happening on June 7th. It's the first Tuesday of the month. We're doing a meeting every other month. This was a special meeting that we were doing in partnership with APIC Spokane. Join us next month, though, as we present a little bit more about SCAR's Reading Club and what that's going to be about and what that's going to be like. We want more of our community to get engaged with each other. The second half of that meeting is going to be about creating community around activism. So make sure that our activists and everybody who's doing a lot of this work is mentally healthy and feel that we're supported when we do what we do. Thank you so much, APIC Spokane. See y'all next month.